Great. So we have three wonderful people here who are going to talk about people that we ought not to have forgotten about, but we have. And thank you for keeping them alive in our memory and for our record. As your book says, uh, Indian women and their journeys from the salon to the studio. Your book, The Last Courtesan, which is such a moving work, really. It's on your mother. And Madhur, your work as well. I mean, it was The Courting Hindustan. Amazing book. So we have three really very talented people. I'm going to let you perform at the end, or ask you to perform at the end. But I want to start with you, Manish, because your work telling your mother's story, I think it's such a moving portrayal. It's so frank. She comes across as great fun, but also as very gritty. And your relationship is amazing, the way you tell the story. So do you want to tell us a little about your mother and why you wrote this book, which is part tribute, part memoir, and I think part therapy for you?
Thank you, Kaveri. And it's my first time in Odisha, and I'm so glad to see such a huge audience for us. It really starts on a good note when she says that we should not be forgotten. And that's the main reason why I wanted to write about my mother, because she always wanted not to be forgotten. She wanted to tell her own story, but she didn't have the tools to tell the story. So she raised me, she gave me an education, and she realized that someday I would be the vessel through which she could tell her story.
Tell her story. Tell people a little about.
So she was sold in a quota when she was a young girl, and she found herself in a situation where she thought that she would have to maybe adapt and survive because there was no way to get out of it. And she did that for a very long time, I suppose, in Calcutta and then in Bombay also. This was, I think, in the 70s, 80s, and a little bit of the 90s also. But the quota culture was on the decline from the 80s onwards, when the girls were switching into dance bars and they were getting into sex work. So that was the time when she had to make up a choice whether to move into that work or continue as the wife. But since it was on the decline, she decided to move into a more quieter, solitary life as a housewife without a husband.
And as a mother whose son was mostly away from her.
Yes, yes. I mean, she put me in a boarding school when I was about 4 or 5 years old in Darjeeling. And so that gave me the ammo to be able to discover her life and write about it.
Right. Madhur, what drew you to writing about some of the most amazing women? I mean, I knew vaguely about some of them, but just to see the array of wonderful women who've sort of been forgotten and who, I once remember Vidya telling me, who should actually all be gurus and, be called guru bais, but very rarely were.
So, very correctly said that these women of great character who were repositories of high art, at some point, they were all forgotten because of how male dominated the society is, right? So to just add on to that, I will just read my opening paragraph of the book itself. So when we think of Ramayana, glorious tales of victory of Rama over Ravana comes, Mahabharata, Arjun's victory come, but we rarely do ever think about Shikhandi or Shabri, right? So when women of such character, like Sita, Ahalya, Draupadi, who were the epitome of modesty, of greatness, they had to really fight to maintain their identity, to be recognized. Then women who were divorced fabricated notions of lajja,
Right.
you know, of sharam, of haya, you know. तो उनकी तो कौन ही मतलब बात करेगा. In fact,
Exactly.
people, and especially post British colonial era, you know, when the idea of what is pure, you know, Puritan thoughts came into being, then even more so, Indians were especially ashamed of a culture that we have been very comfortable with, you know, because dancing, music, I mean, our gods dance, everybody
Exactly.
sings, you know, Krishna plays the flute, Ganesha dances, Shiva does the tandava. So dance music has been very integral to Indian ecosystem. And then post the British culture, you know, where all the thoughts about, all the Abrahamic thoughts about purity came into being, is actually when very thought conscious desensitization of women performers, you know, and again, I have been saying it was just not about performances, but everything Indian was turned down, whether it was textile, whether it was music, whether it was dance, whether it was the infrastructure, architecture. But yes, especially my book talks about 10 very important women from prehistoric to post-independent India who stood their ground, you know, come what may, and kept performing and carrying on the tradition that they were born into.
And there's some marvelous descriptions there, but what really, was magnetic was Gohar Jan. I mean, what a woman. Please talk about her too. And then I'll come to you, of course, for Begum Akhtar. But talk about Gohar
So
Jan.
Gohar
What a
Jan,
character.
amazing. I mean, we forget that these women were the heroines of their time. They were the
Yeah.
Madhuri Dixits and Deepika Padukones of their times. You
Yeah.
know, so they were full diva and full.
They
you
were
know,
better, I think.
They were better. They had much more class. They had much more understanding of music, of poetry. In fact, आपने मनीष जी ने बोला है कोठा कल्चर, तो
हाँ.
कोठा में जो नवाब होते थे, होने वाले नवाब होते थे, उनको भेजा जाता था टू अंडरस्टैंड तहजीब, तमीज़, उठना बैठना, शायरी कैसे करनी है, बात कैसे करनी है.
जी.
एंड दिस वाज ऑल अ कल्चर विच वाज प्रोपिगेटेड बाय द कोर्टिजन्स, यू नो, क्योंकि वही जैसे आप गौहर जान की बात कर रही हैं, गौहर जान became one of the richest women in Calcutta in her times, you know.
And she used to drive her own car.
बग्गी, हाँ, तो उस वक्त वाइसरॉय के अलावा
फिल्म क्यों नहीं बनी है उन पर अभी तक?
आई थिंक देयर इज वन,
किसी को बना है?
आई थिंक देयर इज वन,
कौन सा? अच्छा.
बन रही है अभी उस पे. बट हाँ, मतलब वाइसरॉय के अलावा कोई 6 हॉर्स की बग्गी ड्राइव नहीं कर सकता था. वो रोज 500 रुपए फाइन देती थी कि मैं करूंगी. यू नो, सो दीज वर वुमेन ऑफ कैरेक्टर एंड दे वर नॉट जस्ट ऑर्डिनरी वुमेन हु वर स्लीपिंग अराउंड और हु वर ऑफ लूज कैरेक्टर. इट इज अ मिसकंसेप्शन व्हेन एनीवन connotates that courtesans directly mean a woman of loose character. Absolutely not.
Right.
Like a free liberated woman has the liberty to choose partners, howsoever, in today's time. Similarly, in those times,
Yeah.
some women only had one loyal partner for their entire life.
Right.
It was just their profession that they were in public view for everyone.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
They were the first public figures as well. Vidya, I'll come to you because I think you're one of the first who really understood this idea that we need to record we need to chronicle these wonderful women before they're lost to history. So tell me about what drew you to them.
I think I was, it was a bit of a shaking up that really drew me very close to them. At the end of a performance in Delhi, I was kind of feeling very happy with myself because it was a good response. People clapped and, but there was this elderly gentleman who came and, he gave me these 2 cassettes with a lot of scribbling on the inlay. And he said, "Tumhe lagta hai tum gaati ho? Ye suno." And that seemed very insulting at that point because I was quite happy with my singing actually. So he said, "Ye suno aur phir mere se baat karna." And for the longest time, I did not look at those cassettes because I genuinely felt ki ye kya matlab hai, But one spring cleaning day, I did pick them up and I started looking at the names and, there was Gohar Jan, there was Zohrabai Agrewali, There was Hingan Bai, there was Kiti Jan, there was Umda Jan, and suddenly I'm like, what are these names? And along with the names, I could see bandishes, thumris, ghazals, things that we sing today on stage with zero baggage. You know, I can get onto stage and sing whatever I want to. But that really led me to setting up my project, which is titled Women on Record.
On Record.
And it's about the women who sang on the gramophone record, but importantly, I realized there's no record of who these women were.
Yeah.
So that was really how I got really hooked onto this time. And Kaveri, I realized that there were almost 500,000 records that were published in the first half of the 20th century. And we can barely access 20% of them.
That's
and a lot of these are with private collectors, very little with institutions, with government institutions that are supposedly committed to this kind of chronicling. Yeah. So.
And this journey, where all has it taken you in your both your, mentally as well as physically?
So mentally, I'm very obsessed, no doubt. But actually, in terms of actual travels, it's been a beautiful set of journeys, actually, both in terms of the music and in the literal sense of travels. So a lot in North India, Lucknow, Patna, Kolkata. But I also went to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and all of these countries have had their experiences and histories of recording women. And, you know, so there are beautiful, in fact, when I performed in Bangladesh at the Dhaka Club a few years ago, again, somebody from the audience came up to me and held my hand and was actually moved to tears. And again, I thought it was my singing, but it wasn't. He said, "Aapne abhi gaya Firoza Begum ka ek Faiz Ahmad Faiz ki ek cheez maine gayi thi, Rang pehrahan ka khushboo, Zulf lehrane ka naam." तो ये बड़ी मशहूर हुई थी in the 30s, 40s and the 50s. And so he said, Firoza Begum was my older sister.
Oh.
So Women on Record has really not just been stories, not just been music, but it's been the stories that make this music.
Yeah.
You know, the anecdotes which really go into creating the world of music. And also I just want to add, Kaveri, that you know, my biggest fear was that I should not romanticize this whole period, you know. They were, of course, a lot of them were very good singers. Some of them were very bad singers. And no, I'm just putting it out there because this is also not, it's also the making of entertainment at that time. This is what entertainment was.
Yeah.
You know, and this is what it meant. It meant singing on the record. It meant doing nautanki. It meant transitioning into the talkies when it came to the 30s. So it's really the making of entertainment, the making of the music market, which therefore needs to be documented. And you know, there's a beautiful continuum that one can see in terms of the repertoire, in terms of aap gaane hi dekh lijiye. The whole idea of, I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, that the format of the film song actually comes from the 78 RPM.
Right.
You know? And there are several of those songs which get incorporated in later Hindi films. For example, there are many versions of Mohe pan ghat pe, Mohe pan ghat pe Nand Lal Gher liyo re Mori नाजुक कलैया मरोर लियो रे. This is Indubala who sings it in the 30s. So then there is Inhi Logo Re. There is even Mere Angne Mein Tera Kya. So all kinds. And most, the latest, there's a lot of young faces here. Jhumka Gira Re was recorded in the 30s on the record.
No. Just a little bit.
So the original is a bit sort of slower, and it was sung by this woman called Dulari. And I like mentioning names because they're not just voices; they were actually very, very, you know, talented people. Miss Dulari sang this song, and it was Jhumka gira re, Jhumka gira re, Bareli ke bazaar mein Jhumka gira re.
How wonderful. And we just think of it as, Alia Bhatt.
Hi, Jhumka. Oh, Jhumka.
Exactly.
It's wonderful. It's beautiful, but
But there's a history to it. Madhur, it's the same with you, right? I mean, when you when you talk about Jadan Bai or when you talk about Begum Akhtar, we'll go back to Begum Akhtar with you, Vidya, because you're like the expert, the OG on her. But Jadan Bai, for instance, I mean, she was so many things, not just Nargis's mother, but she was a film producer. She was. So, when you were researching this, were you yourself surprised by some of the things that you unearthed?
Thank you. I think I was very surprised to see the prolific women that these are. I mean, absolutely not one-dimensional, have a plethora of all the talents that one can possess, because even Jadan Bai, now that you mentioned, she did actually begin singing only, she was not so great at it, like you're saying, some of them were not so great, but she had a great business insight.
Right.
So she understood when the Bombay film industry was just coming up, imagine the strength of character one needs to uproot oneself
yourself.
from Calcutta, which was the hub of high-end culture at that time,
Yeah.
and say, I want to put my bucks, in this new industry. And not just that, so she was not one of those people who went door to door and said, give me a role, give me a film. She made her own production house.
Yeah.
Can you believe? She was one of the first women producers to exist ever. So I think people like Jadan Bai and Gohar Jan and, everybody else, they had a lot of strength to character, but we were discussing on via emails that yet these women are not given the kind of respect that they deserve, even in today's time. क्योंकि आपने बोला था कि हम मेल टीचर्स को तो गुरुजी बहुत जल्दी बोलना शुरू कर देते हैं और फीमेल टीचर्स को हम लोग गुरु नहीं बोलते हैं. For some reason we call them Didi. I have no clue why we do that.
Why can't we just call them Guru?
So I always have called my female teachers Guru Ma, Guru Ji. I have never gone with this Didi culture, but I think it's a systematic, masochistic, dominance that the society has. Also has something to do with, the psyche of women always wanting to be projected as young, because as soon as you're a guru, you're older. But
ऐसा नहीं है. So we are quite happy to age.
But the point that I'm making is, ये जो भी courtesans हैं मेरी book में, especially whether it was Vasant Sen or Amrapali, or it was Bala Saraswati, who was alive till whenever 80s. इनका बहुत ही dual edged life रहा है, because on stage now we are all on stage, but earlier it used to be private gatherings only. They're venerated, they're celebrated, they're loved, they're adored. But as soon as that curtain goes down, they're looked down upon. They are not to be talked. They're outcasts. So there's also because आपने हमने बोला था कि कुछ सोच के आइएगा. तो हमारे शास्त्रीय नृत्य में भी, because I'm an Odissi dancer myself and mu tiki tiki odia bujuchi tiki tiki can speak also. Actually, Odisha more Matrabhumi asuchi, and mu basi basi happy to be here. So in classical arts, the heroine is always in distress for some reason, So there is an Ashtapadi. Yeah, exactly. Either she's waiting or she's distressed. So there's an Ashtapadi Yami hai. So it goes Yami hai Kami ha sharanam Sakhi jana vachana vanchita. कि हे नाथ, अब मैं किसकी शरण में जाऊं, मेरी तो सारी सखियों ने भी मुझे धोखा दे दिया है. एंड देन इट गोज ऑन यामी है कामी ह शरणम यामी है कामी ह शरणम यामी है कामी ह शरणम सखी जन वचन वंचिता। तो वो बोल रही है कि मैं अग्नि में कूद जाती हूँ, मैं पानी में गिर जाती हूँ, मैं ये धरती फट क्यों नहीं जाती, मैं चली क्यों नहीं जाती हूँ उसमें. So that is one way in which women are portrayed in
Right.
classical arts, especially, and again, जो विद्या जी गाती हैं मैं करता हूँ, because these women kept it intact. नहीं होता तो हम नहीं करते आज. But again, even in Shastriya Nritya, there is another Ashtapadi called Yahi Madhava Yahi Keshava, जिसमें the hero has come after making love with some other woman and he is expecting कि ये तो मेरी प्रिय है, ये तो मुझे माफ कर देगी. So she says, याहि माधव याहि केशव मावद कैतव वादम मावद कैतव वादम. मुझसे तुम झूठ मत बोलो, go away. And she walks off stage, you know. So that also like shows the strength of character that these women had to reject a hero, you know, and they felt themselves to be strong enough that they don't want any male counterpart. And I think all of the women courtesans, you know, came from that very strong matrilineal sort of an existence and lived their life on their own terms.
Right.
So yeah.
And really, Manish, your mother was one of them. I mean, she didn't desist from calling a spade, right?
Yes, I mean, she, I think it's also because she didn't have anybody to go to. She didn't have anybody to guide her. And she realized that only my instinct will work. And if I want to take charge of my life and if I don't want to be dominated by anybody, then I'll have to make all my decisions myself, because she was very, very young when she was sold in the quota. She must have been about 10 years old or 12 years old. And when a little girl of that age is abandoned in that sense, in a world where she doesn't know where she belongs, she toughens up very quickly to survive, because that's the only way to make it out there.
And, you know, there's some portions which are really, which you feel, I mean, I felt like crying when I was reading them. I don't know how you felt when you were writing it. For instance, her nose pin that is stolen by a former patron. And then there's one gentleman who comes in the end and restores it to her in a way. I found that so touching, you know.
You're the first person to actually speak about that. Nobody has pointed that out to me, and that was something very instrumental in writing that at the very end of the novel, of the memoir.
Of the memoir.
Because the nut is so important
Yeah.
to the courtesan, where एक नथ उतारने की ceremony होती है.
बिल्कुल.
और वो ही चली जाए तो फिर you know, in the end, when she wears that nut, it's sort of like her regaining her sense of self to start and reinvent herself again.
Yeah. And I thought that was, I wonder how you felt when you wrote it.
Filmy.
That's because you're a film person. But just the relationship with your mother and the way you were recording, and she said, मैंने तो ये नहीं कहा, मैंने तो वो नहीं कहा. But there was a lot of that to and fro, right?
Yes, that was, that's how she spoke. And somebody, in fact, wrote a review of this book on Facebook saying, the language is yours, but the words are hers. And I felt that was so apt to describe how the book is written in her voice.
Would you like to read a little bit from it?
You know, when you asked me to read, and I just thought, this is the first time I'll ever be reading something.
You're doing well, so it's okay. Don't be nervous.
Very nervous. But
I know, but these two are so accomplished.
I
वो
mean-
तो कोई भी nervous हो जाएगा, but don't be nervous.
Exactly, it's because of them. But when you asked me to read something, and I picked up my book and I opened, and it opened on this page. So I would advise a little bit of listeners' discretion for this section. One morning I stepped out, went down the building and was looking for a rickshaw when Pushpa understood I was going to the Howrah railway station. She came down and dragged me back inside, saying I could not leave. Why will you not even let me leave? I shouted. Where will you go? What will you do? She said. You will be torn to pieces by this world in seconds. Do you know who you are? I was aware of my reputation. I had earned it. I was a Baiji. Khangi ho, Randi ho, she shouted. Randi, she screamed and hurled abuses at me. A crowd gathered, attracted by the booming, harsh, and loud sound of that one word. I knew what it meant, but in her screaming voice, it came out like a radio announcement. Randi. It sounded horrible. I knew it had the power to stop any man in his tracks and make him stare. It also made everyone stare accusingly at the person who was being shouted at. I was being called a Randi. I was being disgraced. I was being humiliated in broad daylight in front of a crowd. She pulled at my sari. I felt naked, being harassed in public. The word was shrill and loud and deafening. Randi. That is how people saw us. I was not a prostitute, but how does any man know better than to judge us as one when one of our own is calling us a whore, a Randi? That was the first time someone had called me a name that I was not in a public place, in an open street where strangers were walking by, most of whom stopped by to stare at me. Their eyes burnt into me, my skin crawled. The light in the sky was too bright, too harsh. Being dragged back from under the clear blue sky was like being pulled into a pool of darkness, into a pitch dark cave where I belonged, where women like me belonged. It was a worse feeling than leaving, to be forcefully pulled back from escaping, with the humiliation that I was no ordinary woman. I was branded a whore. I was stripped of any dignity I might have had as a nobody. This was a sickening realization that I had no place in the world when I had just about mustered up enough courage to step out into it.
Wonderful. But also very tragic. Vidya, have you had that experience? Have you sensed that sense of shame or outrage when you've come across these histories?
You know, one of the challenges that I faced, I have to admit, is I didn't have too much of first-person kind of interaction because, like I said, I'm looking at early 20th century in my work. But what I did see was a lot of denial. I saw a lot of sort of walking away. You know, when I reached out particularly to the patrons of this time. So one of the trips that we made very often in the course of the book and the research that I was doing was to the badis in Kolkata, where a lot of these soirees would happen. And there were specific times in the year when it was like a jashan, you know, like Durga Puja, for example, was one time of the year when the rich zamindars could afford to invite Baijis of name and fame and, celebrated names of their time. So we went to these badis, and interestingly, they still have spaces, which in fact we've documented in the book. They still have spaces which are frozen in time, you know, like really elaborate silver furniture, beautiful bone china, beautiful china, beautiful, artifacts like an old phone, a dial-in kind of a phone. A lot. So they have a room where obviously this mehfil used to take place, which is
just kept as it is.
हाँ, उसको चद्दर से ढक के रखा हुआ है so that धूल ना लग जाए, kind of a thing. Chandeliers, everything.
But chaddar for many other reasons.
Exactly. So when we asked the the people who were living in those badis, and ki kaun sab aaye the, and we actually were able to acquire invites from that time, from some collectors. So we knew ki inke ghar mein fala bai aayi thi aur ye hua tha. So if we would ask the person who was living in that house कि बताइए ना कैसे रहा, सर नहीं हमारे यहाँ ये लोग सब नहीं आते थे. There was this complete denial.
Right.
So there is obviously, they don't want to be associated with something that subsequently becomes stigmatic, which sees stigma, which sees marginalization, and we see that progressively happening as we move closer to the nationalist movement, as we move closer towards 1947 and thereafter, and when institutions like the All India Radio and such government state institutions come in place, how they deliberately, in a very considered way, they push these women, these performers out of the mainstream fray. So much so that in the 50s it was this is all also hearsay. Some of these things do not get into official documents, but we did get to know that only married women could perform.
Right.
Only married women could record. So clearly suggesting that Bais, Devis, Begums, etc. will have to wait for their turn. And so some of them, in fact, christened themselves as Devis, because that seemed more acceptable, right?
Right.
So yes, I mean, this was a very rich history that we've had, which has been in many ways pushed out for political reasons, cultural reasons, reasons of technology, of how men suddenly realized that, these women, these baijis who were recording suddenly became popular. There was a whole commercial angle to this.
Making a lot of money.
So suddenly the ustads felt that, it's not such a bad thing after all. Because when it started, there was a hesitation because this was predominantly a male system. It was an oral tradition. Right. So it was beneath the ustads to actually sell their music to a music company or to put it out there on record. Selling is not a good thing. B, then, you're actually putting your repertoire out there for public consumption. So these men now turn around, they want to sing on the record. Women, married women, suddenly realize the anonymity that the record offers. So there is a great there's a democratization of the listening and the performing space that's going on, which, in the process of which the Bais and the other women who come from these considered traditions lose out. Yeah.
We cannot let you go without talking about Begum Akhtar.
So Kaveri is being very kind and going on about this. I was, of course, very privileged to have learned from Begum Akhtar's senior most student, Shanti Hirananji, which is why I was lucky to have also heard some stories about Akhtari, or Ammi as my guru used to call her. And I think if there is one thing that blows my mind, it is her journey from being a Bai to a Begum, and how she starts out as Akhtari Bai Faizabad and is now remembered as Begum Akhtar. So, and there is so much to her life in terms of struggles and tragedies. But I think what really stands out for me is the wit that stays all through her life, her sense of humor, her quirkiness. For example, she was once in a recording studio waiting for her sazindas to come, and very unconventionally, the accompanist, one of the accompanists had not yet arrived. It's usually the other way around, right? The main artist is there and arrives later. And so she said, "Khan sahab kahan hai? Abhi tak nahi aaye. Recording ka time ho gaya hai." So the tabla player says, "ऐसा है कि उनकी अभी नई नई शादी हुई है, तो ज़रा घूमने गए हैं, तो इसलिए लेट हो गए हैं." तो पता चला कि खान साहब की शादी एक धोबन से हुई है. तो वो जब घुसे स्टूडियो के अंदर, तो अख्तरी से कुर्ता बड़ा साफ पहना है आज. So she was known for these kind of repartees, which really made her a very fun and feisty person. Yeah.
So you have to sing one last song for us from her before we let you go.
Okay. For this one, I'm going to keep my tanpura a little bit so that it's not... Sorry, one second. हमारी अटरिया पे आओ सावरिया, देखा देखी बलम हुई जाए। हमारी अटरिया पे आओ सावरिया, देखा देखी बलम हुई जाए। आवो बलम तुम, आवो सजन तुम हमरे द्वारे, सब दिन का झगड़ा खत्म हुई जाए। हमारी अटरिया पे।
The most sublime way to end this session.
Thank
you
you.
all very much. And Manish, you did a great job.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Madhur. Thank you, Vidya.